My name is Jill Faulkner. Um, Gosh, who am I in the work? I think I'm really a grassroots worker whose experience has been shaped by the lives of the many people that I've worked alongside. So I come from Aotearoa. I live on the lands of the First Peoples of Australia and have lived on these lands for longer than my own. Um, I am part of queer communities. I'm a mother and a grandmother, most importantly and significantly. And I've been working, I think, at the intersections of power, structural and systemic power, across many, many years. And yet the system would imagine that I've been working with interpersonal acts of violence, abuse, both to those that have harmed and those who've been harmed. And so I say that very deliberately because I think there's a very distinct link, between structural and systemic violence and the experiences that people have, both interpersonally and in their relationships with others. When I started my master's, I was working with women in prison, and that was across two different roles that I had. But what really struck me was that I really wanted to focus on an investigation, an inquiry into how power is used and how power moves in systems. And my first role was to support women with experiences of trauma to be able to access counselling post their release. And what wasn't new to me, but I guess reinforcing of the way that our service system can also replicate violence was that the system was constructed of feminist services who speak to an ethic of feminism, but also have feet in both camps. They would say they were trauma-informed, and these services were generally centre-based. They were generally they were set up on a premise of working with readiness. So people had to demonstrate a readiness to be engaged in the proper work, the work of counselling. But also there was an idea that abuse, violence, and the trauma that occurs out of people who experience these would be discrete. That would be the work, and that any relationship to alcohol and drugs or mental health issues would be dealt with by other workers. And so what happened in that process, of course, was that women who were being released from prison, generally released into homelessness, released either back onto the streets, released with escalating mental health issues as the unpredictability of their life became more and more extreme and critical. Often were seeking safety in the spaces that had previously led to their incarceration. So often women who had been working as sex workers or dealing drugs in order to survive were faced with the only point of connection being, their drug dealer or the work that they knew. And of course, this made them very visible in the system, and it really escalated their lack of safety. In fact, we were not remembering them back into communities. Often these women had never had membership of the communities that we take for granted. So I guess that was my first experience. And the program wasn't refunded, but the service system remained unexamined. And I think that really stood out for me. And then not long after that, I was asked to provide programs for women who'd been incarcerated who'd used interpersonal violence. And it became very clear to me that there was no understanding of gendered experiences of violence, that the violence of the system and the structures were completely invisibilized, erased, and not seen in any way as relevant to what they were hoping would be a very criminogenic response to women's use of violence. And I think that was very uncomfortable to me. It didn't fit with the voices, the many stories of the women that I'd spoken to in prisons. And in line with the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence in 2016, they estimate 80% of women who are incarcerated have experiences early adverse experiences of childhood sexual abuse, violence occurring in the home or targeting them as teenagers or young people and adults, then experiencing family violence, violence in relationships, violence that is coercive and directly related to the offending. And so I was very interested in examining how structural and systemic power operated in the lives of these women and how we might be able to develop a narrative practice that contested the ways that power was enacted over women's lives. And I noticed that it occurred in the way that we binarize most of our language. And so I wanted to understand that. I wanted to investigate that in the hope that the complexity of women's lives will become more visible, not only to the woman, but also socially more visible, so that we might stand against some of the dominant discourses that tend to pathologize and criminalize women. You know, we use binarized language, you know, right across all of the intersections of our social domains, our social locations, you know, whether it's sex, gender, sexuality, race, culture, class, ableism. We use binary notions which look like they're naturalized, but in fact they're not. They're socially constructed. So victim-perpetrator is a binary that emerges out of male and female. And at its extreme positions in a continuum, it is the force of sexism, so these binaries are always hierarchical. One is positioned in relation to the other, and the hierarchy, the superior binary, gets its power in relation to the other. So it's a practice of othering. It's a practice of dehumanizing. It's a practice of subjugation. It's a practice of oppression. And so as I started to explore the binaries, you know, that particularly even if we look at gender, if we look at male and female, you know, that gender is actually a performance. It's not a static identity. It's an act, and it's the way we perform the act. And that's the same in many, many binarized locations. And so what had occurred to me is that these binaries hid the operations of power, and they operated across people's lives in multiple social locations. So I wanted to understand, particularly in relation to interpersonal violence, the binaries, you know, that had continued its operations on women in ways that had invisibilized the activity of these binaries. And so if I started to look at, you know, sexism, and we looked at, you know, man and woman, we looked at, you know, men are seen as perpetrators, women are seen as victims. So then there are other assumptions about how women must operate or act or perform their gender. And these binaries are supported by systemic and structural discourses like white body supremacy, the colonial discourse, like patriarchy, like sexism, like heteronormativity. And so the way that the binaries hold their power is through the systemic and structural discourses that legitimize the othering of the inferior person. And so what happens, for example, in race is that whiteness is seen as superior, and that Aboriginal or First Peoples are seen as the inferior and othered. And so whiteness then claims the right to name the other. And the other then must reclaim their identity in order to claim who they are. And so these binaries, you know, are acting on our lives all the time. And so I think it's really important. The relationship with feminist intersectionality is that feminist intersectionality understands that across multiple social locations that we experience advantage and oppression or discrimination in very different ways, and that unless we understand that and how they're maintained by systemic and structural structures, systemic structures, then we fail to see the operations of power. And what we do by default then is that we pathologize, we criminalize the individual. We don't understand that these are social issues that are socially constructed. And so what it means is that often, particularly for women in prison, they see themselves as a perpetrator, because that's the language that's used. It's a gendered language. It comes out of a gendered history of exploring men's violence. However, we haven't nuanced that. We haven't understood that for women who are also socialized under patriarchy, their experiences are not of entitlement. Their experiences of being othered, of being inferior, of being subjugated. And so unless we understand that, we could then fall into the trap of thinking that women's use of violence is similar to men's use of violence. And in fact, that's not the case. And it certainly wasn't the case for these women. And so what I came to understand in conversations with at least 300 or more women across 3 to 4 years, I never met a woman who hadn't been responding to childhood sexual abuse. And many of those women, of course, as we know around adverse childhood events, that it leads to an incredible distress in the body, an incredible distress in the minds. It disrupts these women's lives. And these women, as children, are seeking safety. Often the safety is found in alcohol or other drugs. Our mental health system is very ready to pathologize them, but the medication often doesn't mitigate the suffering. And so what I became interested in is, what are the stories of these women's lives? How can we tell these stories in ways that overt the injustice of their lives and how they've been seeking justice and what it is that they're standing for in these particular ways? And so what I saw unresolvedly is that interpersonal violence is directly related to the structural and systemic violences and abuses that are upheld by our dominant discourses and enacted through binarized languaging. Most people work in a service system that has been trained to replicate the violence of these structures. And so, for example, in the violence sector, domestic and family violence, and sexual abuse sector, services are speaking to a feminism that is more of a white feminism. It's a feminism where white women have privilege off the backs of other women of colour, First Nations women, who were still suffering while white women moved towards some of the privileges of the patriarchy. And so by default, our service systems have also engaged in this discourse. And so when services say that they're feminist, it doesn't mean that they have an understanding of the intersections of women's lives across race, for example, across sexualities. It doesn't mean that white feminism is an appropriate lens for understanding queer women or trans women who experience very different challenges in their world. And so you see this also then taken up in other discourses around blaming women for the violence that's occurred because they simply haven't left, and we have an assumption that if women are acting or moving towards safety, they will leave the violence. That's the only option that the service system sees as credible. And so then if children are involved, we will see child protection systems who will remove children despite the fact that the service system hasn't been able to keep the woman or the children safe. They'll remove the children on the grounds that the woman isn't keeping the children safe. In terms of the person enacting the violence return to the home. So I think unless we have a much more nuanced understanding of how advantage and oppression works and how we benefit and how we are also at times marginalized, then we run the risk of erasing people's struggles. And I think it's important to say that people don't experience this disadvantage, this discrimination and oppression discreetly. It gets experienced as a cumulative experience, which means that if you're a woman of colour or an Aboriginal woman, and you've been abused as a child, and you're living in poverty, and you're seeking safety, and you're using drugs and alcohol, which is an outcome of patriarchal violence, then the chances of incarceration are much higher for you. And so I think that's part of the problem of the system, is that the system's conflated the pedagogy in order for it to make sense without understanding where we're advantaged and where we're not. And then as workers, if we're not standing in places of awareness around our own social locations, then we're not attuned to the struggles of others. Then we're invited to take up a position that is non-gendered and non-nuanced, which creates further harm. You know, we were faced with directives to develop a program that focused just on women's criminal behaviour. And we were certainly not prepared to do that. And that felt incredibly unethical. But that was based on an ideological argument around what is ethically right. And so we did develop a program that was really located in dignifying women. What we wanted to do was to create a place where women could see the operations of power in their life, where women could see how patriarchy had recruited them like men, but with different effects into understanding their location in society. We wanted to avert that so that women could understand hierarchies and see how they were expressed in their families, see how they were taken up more broadly in society, so that they could then start to understand how their experiences were linked to the broader structural issues of violence. And so, of course, responsibility is one of the key aspects of addressing violence, but that's not the beginning point. The beginning point for us was helping women understand how the system was operating, how the operations of power had shaped their lives, and to also understand what the injustice of this was and how it was playing out in the very system. And we had very many examples in the carceral system to see how that injustice played out. Because these women are responding to binarized power in terms of, you know, the violence of their families, the violence of the carceral system, the way the carceral system sets women up against each other as opposed to connections with each other, the violence of the mental health system that was pathologizing women who were incarcerated because they were anxious, as you would be as you step into an institution that's predicated on violence. That was pathologized. And so women were, and then the criminalizing of women for poverty and for violence that was often resistive. And so women had many stories about how they had lived for many years of their life responding to inhumane acts of violence. And, you know, as the system articulates, they sought help with the police, you know, and that's where the system sits now. The system's not interested in community responses. We've trained people to believe that the system will be your support and that the first port of call is the police. And so women told stories of how they'd gone to the police And the police had said, well, if you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. So the police, was racist, the police was classist, and the police violated many of these women. And there are much more intimate stories of violation that have occurred in the police force. So we're training people to go to the very institutions that enact violence, and then we incarcerate them in violent institutions. So we wanted to be able to avert that. We wanted for women to be able to trap the effects of structural and systemic violence on their lives and how that was taken up, within families, the way that family roles are established. In that, we were redressing social injustice. As we started to address the injustice, women naturally moved towards positions of wanting to take responsibility for the harm that they'd enacted against others. So that I think, the process, and we were engaged in meeting with these women twice a week for 6 months, plus an extra session of counselling or therapeutic work for every woman once a fortnight. I saw these women move from very polarised positions where they needed to scrutinise the room in order to be able to keep themselves safe enough to participate in a safe way. I saw them move towards acts of caring, acts of support. I saw them contesting and standing up against the injustice of not only their lives, but other women's lives. I saw them start to understand how the First Nations peoples of this country, and in particular women, were in fact being targeted, and growing in numbers. And I saw people leaning into that in ways that I have not seen in systems. So I think what I understood is that, we were told to target women's anger, as that was the problem, was their anger. But I think, what we discovered, in fact, that anger was a testimony to something that they cherished that was being taken from them, something that was unfair or unjust. And so many of these women who all self-selected around their use of interpersonal violence to do the group, I think it would be fair to say that their violence was not born out of an entitlement or a desire to control somebody else. Their violence was generally resistive in terms of the violations that had continued to shape their lives, often from the time they were very small. So then, as facilitators, we also hold power. And there is no one approach, certainly as Vicki Reynolds would say, that is free from the operations of power, that is free from replicating that power. And so, we could be invitational around asking the woman to be able to give feedback and things, but nonetheless, there was a power structure, a power order, a hierarchical order in the way that we came into the prison. And so I set up a group of women, women of colour, trans women, and other women who invested in this work, invested in contesting some of the dominant discourses around women's use of violence. And they were my accountability body, if you like. Where we critiqued, we critiqued the approach. And I had co-facilitators. We reflected after the sessions. We had a culture of critique around that. We talked about the discomfort that happened. We talked about what was noticed in the group. And then we took it to the larger group. I took that to the larger group, who then critiqued me and held me accountable in terms of my wonderings, in terms of my earnestness, really, around not wanting to replicate this power. And so that was sort of a very critical element, of the work, because relationally is where we hold power. And relationally is where the power has actually harmed many of these women across their lives. So that was, a very critical element of the work in order to be able to hold myself to account. And at times to be able to go back to women and say, look, I think that this was, like I might have mucked up here, like there might have been another way of saying this, I think that I might have inadvertently caused harm and I'm deeply sorry around that. What would be helpful for you to hear from me in order to make good around this? So we also had to be able to act very transparently, in a way that moved us more and more away from roles to humanity, really. We were working with dignity and humanity and humanizing the woman in the room in ways that many told us was a unique outcome for them across their lives. I think in the work, the program was definitely shaped by narrative practices. We were very open about our own ethics and our own values. We invited people to join us in those ethics, and we could also develop ethics, and the group developed a set of values and ethics, and they also then tracked what the practice of those values would look like. They spoke about if they noticed someone straying from those values, how they might address that. They would check out with people before they did that, so they engaged in consensual acts around offering and giving feedback. But really what we were doing is we were looking at, we initially explored the way that structural violence is actually invisibilized in our society. And we did that very gently, very carefully. We looked at hierarchies very carefully and gently. And then women started to explore in their families, what had happened. And so really what we were starting to do was map the effects of violence, both structurally first, and then how, for example, patriarchy played out in the family. So whose voice was loudest? Who made the decisions in the family? How were children disciplined? What did you learn from your parents about being a child? What did you learn from your parents about being a parent or an adult? How have these ideas shaped who you are today? So we were really mapping the effects of both structural and systemic violence in people's interpersonal lives. And then as we started to map the effects, women started to speak about what it was they gave value to, what it was that they held dear, what it was that they cherished in their world, what it was that they wanted to hold on to. So we started to hear other more subordinate stories that stepped aside from this woman as an offender. We heard alternative stories, and then we worked to kind of thicken those and to track those across time, across landscapes and settings, so that we richly wove together the multi-stories of women's lives, so that there was then a platform, a place for women to stand as they stepped into addressing the violence that they'd enacted. And women wanted to make reparation, and through the course, women came back and reported conversations they'd had with people they'd harmed, reported calls they had, shared letters they'd written, speaking about their deep sorrow about the harm that they'd caused and what it had meant for those people, not positioning their need to be comfortable, but their need to make things right. And so we reauthored, like stories, we reauthored people's sense of identities in relation to the many experiences of their life that stood out richly from single-storied identities that are constructed when you go into prison, when people don't call you by your name, you're called by your criminal record number or your surname. And as we did that, we also started to look at, what had kind of invited people, into these enactments of violence and what kind of challenged it. And so then they explored alcohol and drugs and how they played out in their lives. We externalized, the very drugs that were used, and people stepped forward into those spaces so that the things that had offered them, that had offered them some respite, but were nonetheless an effect of the patriarchal violence, people explored richly as a way of planning out what they would do when they left. Because what happened, what we all knew, is that we were also fighting for some sense of justice in women's leaving, because often the way that women leave prison is dehumanizing. And unless women have stable accommodation, unless they have a degree of support, then there's no way that they can step forward to managing their lives in the ways that they were aspiring to. And these women engaged in counselling. They wanted to make things right. They wanted to disrupt the cycles, that had been enacted in the families and their families. They wanted to offer up something different. And, I think if we'd been able to continue the programs, their pilot programs, but I think if we'd been able to continue them, what we were hoping for is that women who are incarcerated would run these programs with other women, and that would become something that would be shared and developed and grown. These women also they moved from the individual to the collective in terms of violence being a social issue. They wrote poetry collectively. They had that put to music because women kind of connected with the music. They wanted something that would remind them about key learnings that they had drawn from their own experiences. They created artworks that spoke to parenting trees, the tree of life, but as a parenting tree, their own tree of life, and then their tree in terms of how they wanted to parent their children. So there were many of the narrative practices, that we all know that are so enriching of our lives that enabled these women, I think, to step towards dignity, to reclaim, the parts of their life that had been invisibilized and erased, in order to address their violence. We had many conversations with women. We ran focus groups prior to setting up the program, to shape the program, but we also had many conversations with women, as they were leaving the program. And I think that, as an abolitionist, a carceral abolitionist, women are interested in abolition, but women have been trained to believe that the service system and the prisons are the places where change happens. I think through that journey, women started to see that there are other opportunities. And one of the things that women would say is, we are human. And I think what that spoke to is the way that the system inadvertently dehumanizes women, and constructs them as an offender, as a single identity. So I think one of the things that women asked was whether they would ever be able to receive the respect that they felt that they deserved. Women, we have forgotten how to treat people with dignity. And I think as service providers, we often work on inclusion and exclusion, who's right for a service, who's not. We work on a rigid set of rules that are often privileging the workers as opposed to the people who come. So I guess what women have encouraged me to tell people, and certainly conversations with government and royal commissions, is that they deserve dignity and dignity in their world. And that in fact, they've often been incarcerated for crimes of violence that occurred against them where there has never been justice served. These are not women who want retribution. What they want to do is become participating citizens in a world that is respectful and honouring of multiple experiences. And so I guess I would encourage those of us who are working in the system to search deeply for practices of dignity, to understand that our work with individuals is directly linked to the dominant discourses of structural and systemic violence. And if you ignore that, then you run the risk of replicating harm from your position in the service system.